We're all doing good, and we will get started momentarily. There's a lot of stuff to cover. So I have a vague idea how this is going to go, but like I said, there's a lot of stuff to cover. I haven't really put together a list of sources for this just because it's all over the place. So we're going to be talking about the overall picture, some of the main developments that have happened in the past month, where we're at, and where I think we're going. So, yeah, that's about where we are. And I'm going to be playing Diablo 4 because I'm just grinding in it at the moment. And sometimes it's actually easier to be doing something while you're talking. I find when I'm playing like Dark Souls, it's often easier to play the game if I'm talking to someone while I'm playing it. Just because, like in Dark Souls, so much of it is muscle memory. If you're not actively thinking too hard about it, you can just kind of coast by on that, and that's sometimes a little bit easier. So, that being said, let's start off with. So, where are we at the moment? Um, it's not looking good. It's not looking good for Ukraine. First and foremost, the single biggest issue that they're coming across is the issue of Western backing. Now, the U.S. still hasn't been able to get a funding package together. There's a lot of ongoing issues. So let's just kind of unpack this. So one of the main things that brought down Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is that Kevin McCarthy was going to pass this big omnibus spending bill that was going to give aid to Ukraine, uh, Israel, and Taiwan in one big massive bill, and wasn't going to include border security. What the Republican, particularly the Freedom Caucus, wanted was border security. Sorry, just coffee's upset my stomach a little. They wanted border security, so they said, "Okay, we get it, McCarthy. We have a very small majority. The Democrats control the Senate. The Democrats control the presidency. Can we get maybe like 20% of what we want? Like, we understand we're probably going to have to pass Ukraine aid, but if we're going to pass Ukraine aid, could we at least get border security as part of it?" So McCarthy refused to do that, and he was just going to basically pass the Democrat bill as is. So that just got canceled. Um, he got removed from office. Johnson came to power, and Johnson is trying to come up with a compromise bill that will, I believe, the current terms of it is going to be uh, they're going to remove the new funding from the IRS, get border security, and and those two things, and decreased Ukraine funding in exchange for passing the omnibus bill. So a lot of the Republicans and the Freedom Caucus are like, this is still not good enough. I personally think like it's fine. Um, we just want to talk about practical politics. Like I said, I don't think there was really a major expectation that McCarthy was going to get them everything or even most of what they wanted. I think the issue was he didn't get them anything. It's like for kind of an overall view, if the Democrats wanted a 4% spending increase and the Republicans wanted a 4% spending decrease, McCarthy was like, okay, we'll give you like a 3.5% spending increase. And it wasn't really a compromise at all. It was just him completely caving. No one expected him to get negative 4%, but maybe like negative 1% or even just zero would have been a massive improvement. But he didn't do that. So we're heading to the winter recess, and it doesn't look like any aid is going to come from the U.S. until January. So that's going to be what 2 or 3 months where Ukraine has not received any U.S. aid. The EU has been trying to get an aid package together. However, Hungary and Slovakia keep blocking it. Hungary basically is saying at this point in time, look, Ukraine's lost. We have to stop throwing good money after bad. Um, any amount of money we send to Ukraine at this point in time is not going to help them win the war. All it's going to do is just waste cash we could be spending on other areas. So Orban's latest suggestion is let's just make an EU fund, and whoever wants to contribute to it can, but we're not going to have. So what they've been doing at the moment is they've been taking, so all the EU member states pay into the EU fund or whatever, like the federal, the supranatural national budget, and they've been taking the money for Ukraine out of the supranational budget. So what they kind of switched over, what he wants to do is countries can choose to allocate some of their money to it, but no one's forced to participate in it. So Slovakia's reason, other than just kind of the current government being clearly pro-Russia, is Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries on earth, and they don't want to give money to a extremely corrupt government that's probably going to embezzle most of it. Which I mean is fair enough. Germany promised that they were going to be giving, like, I think it was $50 billion. It was some absurd amount of money that they were going to give to Ukraine directly. However, it turned out that they couldn't get that money together. So they keep reducing it and reducing it. And yeah, to my knowledge, the EU keeps saying they're going to get all this cash together, and then either Hungary blocks it, or keep in mind the EU, the eurozone, I think is in recession at the moment, particularly Germany. The whole blockade of Russia basically cut off most of their energy supplies, and the energy supplies they can get now are are much more expensive. In fact, they're buying a lot of Russian oil still. It's just being laundered through India or other third parties. So Russia sells the oil to India, then India sells it to Europe at a marked up price. So Russia's getting the money anyways, but Europe's spending more money and they have to like launder it through India and transport it. So on top of that, the Greens in Germany also closed Germany's nuclear plants, so that reduced the electricity supply by like a further 20%, and prices are going through the roof. So Germany is currently in a recession, and they're throwing money into the Ukraine war. There has been ongoing attempts to increase military production. I believe it was 1 million shells they promised Ukraine by the start of next year. If someone wants to correct me on that, they can. But it was something like 1 million shells they promised. I don't even know if they're going to reach like 300,000 um, shells by the beginning of next year. Uh, Europe has been unable to increase its military production to any significant amount. From the articles I've been seeing, all that's really done is they've just been throwing money at the problem, and it's increased the price, cost of production without actually increasing the amount produced. America, in contrast, has had significantly more luck in, or I guess success in increasing how much they're producing, but it's just nowhere near enough compared to what Russia's doing. Um, it's just kind of a too little, too late scenario when it comes to the EU production numbers. So Ukraine's not getting the money. The money that they are getting promised keeps getting lowered. Once again, keep in mind that the entire Ukrainian government runs on foreign aid money at this moment. They get a trickle of money from the grain deal and from whatever domestic taxation is left. But the overwhelming majority of the money that pays their army and civil servants' salaries comes from various westerns. Is this a video game? Yeah, this is Diablo 4. I'm just talking about Ukraine while I'm playing this. Um, so that's where we're at the moment with regards to funding. If you've looked at what Ukraine is receiving at the moment in terms of the actual equipment, that's gone down to almost nothing. I think like one of the last aid packages that they got from the U.S. was like $100 million or something. Uh, something just kind of irrelevant. It wasn't even like pocket change. The thing is, and people will say like this is me lying or whatever, but if you look at official like Lockheed Martin or whatever results, um, the U.S. only produces something like 500 Patriot missiles a year. I think it's around 500, and that is for everybody. That's for the U.S. That's for Saudi Arabia. That's for Israel if Israel uses them, for their European allies, for Ukraine, and we saw that video where Ukraine fired like 20 Patriot missiles in one go. So they're like out of them. I think the UK only sent them like I don't even know if it was like a couple hundred Storm Shadows or something like that. But these are weapons that take like decades to make significant numbers of. Whereas Russia is mass producing ballistic missiles like crazy. From what I understand is Russia's been heavily stockpiling them, and they have a huge number of ballistic missiles that are in reserve. Now we'll get to what Russia's doing at the moment, and what direction we think they're going. But basically, Ukraine's out of reserves or has very very limited reserves of weapons left. I think the important thing to keep in mind is it's not as if the Western equipment is bad. I don't think I've ever said that. I've never said that the Leopard 2s were bad. I never said that the Storm Shadows were bad or anything like that. The issue is there's just not enough of it. Like when they got the Storm Shadows and the Attackums, they had some success. Like they were able to hit a couple airfields. They were able to hit a couple ships. It's not as if these are bad weapons. It's just France has aimed to double artillery round production. Yeah, but that's like when 2025. It's they say that whether or not they can actually do that is one thing, and that sort of stuff. But like, it's not as if the Storm Shadows or any of this stuff is bad. It's just if you have like 2 dozen of them, the best you can come up with is maybe destroy 2 dozen Russian jets, and that's better than nothing. That's fairly efficient for the like you have a decent like ratio to like hit ratio, probably maybe even better than what Russian equipment has. But if the Russians can produce like 30 times the amount of equipment, uh, and it's only marginal, it's only a bit less effective, then it doesn't really matter. And that's kind of been the whole thing throughout this is are the U.S. anti-tank missiles probably better? Yeah, they're probably better, but as I've said, is it better to have like 37 out of 10 weapons or 5 9 out of 10 weapons? And the Russians are the Costco of military equipment. They produce not the absolute best, but they produce pretty good stuff for the amount it costs and for the amount that they can build. So, is an Abrams a better tank than a T90? Probably, but like a T90 is like a 7 out of 10, or some people have said a 6.5 out of 10, and they have like 4 of those. Um, so also the other thing about sorry, we'll get to Russia in a second, but John, not real name, points out Russia also like people make fun of them for bringing the T-54s and stuff out of storage. I think people have to understand that the T-54s and like the T-62s or whatever their really old tanks are not being used as like frontline vehicles. What they're being used for is artillery or assault guns. So what happens is when the infantry are going in, they'll have some T-54s sitting at the maximum range, and the infantry will call in targets, and the T-54s will fire at them. Like they aren't setting them up up front because obviously modern anti-tank weapons are going to destroy them, but because they're tanks, it means they're a lot more resistant to counter battery fire. Like if the Ukrainians fire artillery rounds at it, you're much more likely to survive in a tank than you are in a self-propelled gun. Yeah, so they're using them as self-propelled guns. Like people make fun of the Leopard ones that they sent Ukraine. Leopard 1 is completely unsuited for a modern battlefield, But at the end of the day, it is an armored, accurate, highly mobile gun. So when it comes, if you're an infantryman, um, anything that gives you more firepower is welcome. Um, it's welcome. Like it's good to have. If you're like an infantryman, anything that gives you more guns to shoot at the stuff that's shooting at you is a welcome addition. So I mean, you might as well use it. If Russia was throwing them in at the front line, that would be a different matter. But I don't think that is what the purpose of them is. I think there's also the idea if they have all this stuff in storage, they might as well just use it up. I think the same idea was with the Leopard ones. They're not like ideal, but we have all this ammo sitting around. We have all these old tanks sitting around. Let's send them to Ukraine. Ukraine can use them uh, as kind of slightly heavier self-propelled artillery. Now I could be wrong about that. That makes sense to me personally. But the point of the matter is the Ukrainians are not getting any aid at the moment, or if they're getting aid, it's like small amounts through back channels or some nonsense. I think there was something at some point where the U.S. was like seizing Ukrainian freighters and sending the weapons to Ukraine. Whenever they start sending the aid out, Israel is probably going to have overwhelming priority. So we have that aspect of it. Um, Ukraine blew through most of its strategic reserves during the counteroffensive. To my understanding, whatever ground they took during the counteroffensive is basically taken at this point in time. Was has been lost, and Russia's retaken it. Once again, it is regardless of whether you are pro Russia or pro Ukraine. I do not understand the narrative that Ukraine attacked into heavily fortified defense in depth Russian trenches when Russia has an air force and Ukraine doesn't, and Russia has like a 5 to 10 times artillery advantage, and somehow Russia took more casualties. Like I don't understand how that's physically possible. How you can deal more casualties to your opponent when attacking a highly fortified position when your enemy has substantially more firepower. And that is the narrative they've continued to say is that okay, we didn't take any ground with the counteroffensive, but Russia somehow took more casualties. And like I've said that in the past when Russia was attacking Bakhmut, they probably were taking about the same or more casualties despite having the advantage in firepower because they're attacking an urban area. And urban areas, especially in Eastern Europe, are natural fortresses because it turns out that that commie blocks are very resistant because they're these giant. They're basically giant fortresses. Um, so I mean, it would have been hard enough if they had air support. And I at the time I said like I feel bad for Ukraine because NATO is blaming them for everything. And they're saying Ukraine's not using combined arms, and I'm like, how can you use combined arms with no air support? I mean, isn't that the entire point of combined arms that you're hitting them from a whole bunch of different vectors at once to kind of overwhelm um, your opponent? Like I don't understand how you can use because combined arms. I thought the whole point was that you well we're combining like tanks, infantry, artillery, uh, missiles, and aircraft. So yeah. So yeah, so Ukraine's not getting any aid. Now, Zelensky has basically acknowledged that the counteroffensive failed. It didn't achieve any of its objectives. And they've announced now that Ukraine is going to go on the defensive, that they're suspending all remaining offensives, and they're going to be trying to build their own fortification line, similar to what Russia wound up doing. Now, maybe somebody can tell me, because I haven't really been able to figure this out. Can you build fortifications in winter? Like maybe you can, and I'm just like dumb for not knowing it. But is it even possible? Like, isn't the ground frozen? I mean, it's got to be at least extremely difficult to dig trenches like when the ground's frozen. It's not as if Ukraine isn't cold in the winter. So I'm just not sure how they would even pull that one off. Um, Maybe if someone in the chat wants to bring that to answer that, but I feel like it's going to be really hard to dig and build massive fortifications like in the middle of the winter when the ground's frozen. Maybe you can do that. I just know in like Canada, for instance, they generally don't do that kind of construction in the winter. Um, they'll build like the buildings themselves, but I'd imagine digging even with heavy equipment is difficult. So I don't know how Ukraine is even going to do this. To be honest, it probably is the right call, and they should have been on the defensive earlier when they still had substantial amounts of strategic reserves. And so this brings us to the other part. So it's been hinted. People keep saying it's going to happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it probably will. Is Ukraine is going to announce another round of mobilization? Now, the next round of mobilization is going to be. Um, I've heard all kinds of different numbers. 17 to 70 in terms of males is the one I've heard the most. But I've also heard that the Russians have been claiming they've been coming across um, significant numbers of women. Now, once again, I don't know if this is true or this is propaganda, but there have been videos coming out, and Military Summary Channel has been talking about it. That as the Russians are going into Avdiivka, they found increasing numbers of female soldiers. So once again, I don't know if this is true or not. I don't know if this is bullshit. I don't know if they were like they could have been a special volunteer group. They could have been support personnel who got like caught at the front line. They could have been like medics or something. We don't know, but that is the ongoing rumor. So I can't confirm nor deny that. But that is possible that at some point they might be starting to do that. So I don't know if people in the chat have heard anything about it, but once again, that's not confirmed, but that is what's been reported, and there has been some video evidence of it. On what scale, though, is the question. Now, the question as to whether Ukraine is running out of manpower is an interesting one, and we've heard all different kind of approaches from this. The Duran, for instance, has been pretty adamant that Ukraine is out of manpower, whereas Alex from History Legends has been saying, no, he doesn't think Ukraine is out of manpower. So the truth of the matter is, ultimately, if countries really need to, they can do total mobilization and just go full on conscription. And even very small countries like Belgium or Holland or Denmark or whatever, if they have conscription and they decide to mobilize their entire adult male population, they can get a lot of dudes together. Like even a very small army can get a small country can get a bigger army than the volunteer army of a larger country. The issue is not so much whether or not you can get the people. One of the problems is training. If you have reservists who receive a decent amount of training, like Israel has a lot of reservists who I believe are decently well trained, so they can be called up on a couple days' notice. They'll come to the front and they'll be reasonably effective. Some reservists you'll have it so they receive a bit of training, and I'm just making these numbers up, but like a trained reservist might only need a month of refresher training to be a competent soldier versus like three or 4 months of new training. You know what I mean, right? Like I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense where I'm going with it. The problem is Ukraine is out of their pre-war volunteer army. They're also out of their pre-war reserves. So they could draft an infinite number of people. Like Ukraine could, let's say Ukraine somehow drafted 10 million people. He drafted 10 million people. They got all of that together. Um, it's like they can't just give 10 million people rifles, even if they had the rifles for them, and then just throw them into the front. Um, they need to get trained. Um, so even if Zelensky tomorrow was going to draft another like 2 or 3 million people, which I don't know if that's possible, but let's just say he can, those guys aren't going to be effective for like a couple months at least. Russia, to my understanding, the troops that they mobilized this year haven't even seen the front lines yet. They've been spending like 6 months to a year getting them trained up, getting them into new units, getting them to be effective soldiers, making sure they have the adequate amount of weaponry for them uh, to go away. Um, so the issue is not manpower per se, because most countries can, if they expand the draft enough, will eventually have enough soldiers to fill the front lines. The issue is it's not efficient or effective to just grab a bunch of dudes, shove guns in their hands, and send them to the front line. Now, we did see some NATO sources saying that they were seeing Ukrainian soldiers who were thrown into the lines with um, like 3 days training. Now, I don't know if that's standard or not, but the point is, in their desperation, they're getting shorter and shorter. Now, if soldiers are on the defensive, my understanding is they require less training, but having effective offensive soldiers have a require a lot of training to be effective, particularly if they're going to be mechanized or combine arms or something like that. And that's the issue Ukraine's facing. Is it kind of doesn't really matter how many people they mobilize if they don't have any of the time to train it. They had a decent number of somewhat trained soldiers. I don't think they had received enough training, but they had gotten some NATO training. But those all got used up during the offensive. So that's part of it. There's also, and someone's pointing this out, there's no rotations at the moment. Generally speaking, soldiers get rotated. That is, I'm just making these numbers up. They serve 4 months on and then 2 months off. They get some break. They get to go see their families. A lot of the Ukrainian soldiers have gotten no time off and no rotation since 2023 or 2022. Once again, well, some are, as John Not Real Name points out, getting the NATO training. It's expedited NATO training. They're not getting the same amount. They're getting similar training, but not nearly as much. Once again, it takes a lot of training, particularly in modern warfare, to build a infantryman, to get a competent tank crew, to get something like that. Yeah, I think the average tour of duty is 7 8 months. I'm just making numbers up to give people some idea of what we're talking about. So there's also the issue of mobilizing women, which has been talked about a lot. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. Honestly, I could see Ukraine mobilizing its female population for purely PR reasons. Like, I could see Ukraine doing that and portraying it as some big feminist victory to try to get more support from the West. But if they've reached the point they're mobilizing females, it's just really bad at this point in time. It's not going well. So that is kind of the manpower situation. That's kind of where we are at the meta. Now let's talk about some specifics. So Russia is slowly pushing along the entire front, from my understanding. The only active offensive position Ukraine still has is they landed some troops on the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson, but they they landed at Kherson, but they aren't able to advance. They have nowhere near the amount of forces, and they have to supply across the river in Russia. I think the only reason they haven't kicked them out yet is because it's useful to let them stay there and to keep bombarding them. They probably could. So Avdiivka, to my understanding, is the last major um, Ukrainian stronghold within the Donbass region. And if it falls, the entire front line is going to move quite a bit back. Now, as with Bakhmut, Russia is attacking it, but they aren't attacking it directly. They've encircled a lot of it, and the idea is they're going to let Ukraine continue to send reinforcements into a encircled city and just keep destroying them. That's continued to be Russia's strategy throughout this. Is that between is that the long term favors them because they have. So this is once again, you can believe this or not. My understanding is that Russia has not used most of the soldiers that it's recruited since the beginning of this war. Um, Russia has not had to do, I think, any conscription since December of last year because they have quite a few. They have quite a few. They have a lot of volunteers. They're getting enough volunteers and contract soldiers that they're able to uh, have those in their army. So a lot of those are just getting built up. A lot of tanks. There's large reserves of ballistic missiles. All that kind of stuff is getting built up behind the lines. They haven't gone all in with it. And a lot of people are wondering. Sorry, we'll get to the spring offensive in a minute. But yeah, so they're gradually going to take out Avdiivka. As Konstantin points out, Putin is calling for an additional increase into the armed forces. Most of these soldiers have not really been doing much other than training, though, and getting ready. And that's why people are thinking that there's going to be a winter offensive. So, that is happening. We'll get more to the winter offensive in a second. The next big thing that's happening is the internal drama within Ukraine between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. Now, this has been a long time thing. This dates back to Zaluzhny was against the counteroffensive, or at least how Zelensky wanted to do it. And there was a thing where he got hit in a Russian airstrike, and then he was in the hospital for a couple of months, and he kept showing up a bit, and there was some speculation that it was a deep fake. And there's been this sniping between Zelensky and Zaluzhny for the last 6 months or so, where basically they've been trying to throw each other under the bus. Zelensky's been saying he's incompetent. Zaluzhny's been saying Zelensky's incompetent. And they're just constantly sniping at each other. And Zelensky's begun trying to do purges. He's purged the Ministry of the Interior, of the deputy ministers. He started purging some of the generals. Members of his party have come out and said that Zaluzhny is incompetent. There's no plan to win the war, which is accurate. I don't think Zaluzhny has any plan at this point in time. Zaluzhny was just MIA for most of the counteroffensive. There was a lot of pressure on Zelensky to hold presidential elections this year, which he's announced are just not going to happen. And the fear was that Zaluzhny was going to run against him and take office. Now, for whatever reason, people think Zaluzhny is going to negotiate with Russia. I don't really get how that would even work, because from my understanding, Zaluzhny is like a Banderite. So he seems like, I feel like the hardliners would put Zaluzhny in power if Zelensky was going to negotiate. So this story came out from Seymour Hersh, which I don't believe, but I think is indicative. So the claim is that Zaluzhny is negotiating with Gerasimov, who is, I believe Gerasimov is the head of the Russian General Staff and is in overall charge of the Russo-Ukraine war. And the claim is that Gerasimov and Zaluzhny have been negotiating behind the scenes at the front line, and they've been trying to come to some sort of agreement that will cut out Zelensky and will result in this whole thing being resolved without Zelensky. Now, I don't believe this really. I think, and people are saying who leaked this? Was it Russia? Was it Zaluzhny? Was it somebody else? I personally think Zelensky leaked this as he's trying to portray Zaluzhny as being a traitor, and he's trying to find a reason to remove him. And this makes it look like he's double crossing Ukraine and going behind their back. Um, so I personally think Zelensky was behind this leak. Reason why I don't think it's real is part of the term. So the terms were Russia would keep the territory it currently has. The conflict would be frozen. Um, Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO on the condition that no NATO forces were stationed in Ukraine. I think that there's a 0% chance of this being true. The entire purpose of this operation was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. I don't think under any circumstances they would be allowed to join NATO. I don't think there's any situation on any peace deal that would happen. Russia would never accept that. Once again, that was the entire point of this war. I don't think Gerasimov is really like in a position to negotiate. I just nothing about it makes any kind of sense. I maintain that this whole thing was leaked probably by Zelensky to set up a snake inning of Zaluzhny. Once again, keep in mind Zaluzhny's chief of staff or his chief aide got killed because it was his birthday and a grenade went off in his house. No, the claim is that he was playing with a grenade for God knows what reason, and the grenade just spontaneously went off and killed him. And we also had the wife of the head of intelligence getting poisoned by heavy metals. Now it seems like she's going to be okay, but there's a lot of like just stuff like this going on at the moment. Of just these intrigues of Giesler ops going on from behind the scenes. So, how much of this is real? How much of this is Russia trying to do propaganda? I'm not sure. Russia, I think, is trolling. So, like, and I've talked about this in the past, but Russia's announced uh, they've been like there's an expression in my family that I always do whenever it's like a secret code called the pirate ship sails at night. So like the Russian government has been issuing press statements where they're like, "Patriots are in control. We're activating all of our sleeper cells in Ukraine. We have all these like sleeper cells. We're activating them. We're gonna have Maidan 3, and we're gonna overthrow Zelensky." And I think it's bullshit. They probably have some spies, but they don't have nearly probably what they're claiming to have. And I think the whole thing is just to gaslight Zelensky. Because it's possible they have them, and it's possible they're activating them. And Zelensky's currently involved in like 3 different power struggles. So I think it's just to fuck with him, to be honest. I don't. So the level of paranoia is really high there. Um, I forgot to mention it, but yes, this is Diablo 4. The other thing that people are saying is that this whole defensive posture is a scam to pay corrupt Ukrainian corrupt construction companies to build these defensive lines that are never going to be finished, which is probably true. That is an ongoing issue throughout this war. That was an issue that the nationalist forces had during the later stages of the Chinese Civil War, wherein I think the KMT like local commanders were just super corrupt, and I think a lot of them sold like supplies to the communists, and they just America gave them huge amounts of aid, but it just was not being effectively used because of how the corrupt they were. Now, to be fair to the KMT, they were not nearly that bad at the start of World War II. They had their entire army destroyed by Japan like 3 or 4 times, and by the end, they were not sending their best. But that's something to keep in mind. So, that's kind of where we are with Ukraine's internal intrigue. Somebody made an interesting point the other day. Um, someone made an interesting point the other day. Specifically, Alex Christoforou from the Duran. Someone brought up that someone brought up what would it matter at this point if Ukraine actually did join NATO? So Stoltenberg and the crew are talking about how they're accelerating Ukraine's entry to NATO. They're going to get Ukraine into NATO as soon as possible. They start talking about maybe we'll only bring part of Ukraine into NATO. Maybe we'll only bring in the parts that were west of the Dnieper into NATO. And his is like, what would it even matter if Ukraine was in NATO at this point in time? What would NATO do? Is Europe really going to send large numbers of soldiers to fight Russia? Are they going to send their air force to fight Russia? Is America going to like what are they going to do? The only thing I think they really could do is threaten to use nukes. And is that going to be popular in the US? Is that going to be popular in Britain and France? To like threaten nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine? I just can't see that happening. Like, are they going to send like whole US Army divisions? I can't see that like going down. I mean, can any of you see that going down? But so like, what are they going to do if they get Ukraine into NATO? Maybe a year or two ago that would have been a thing, but I think Russia will just call their bluff and just say, okay, send the dudes in, and it's like the American public is never going to buy that. The also none of these armies work. Like Schultz announced that he was going to like completely rebuild the German army. They were going to do like $100 billion, but the German army is in way worse shape than it was prior to the war. They're like their ammunition stocks were already non-existent. Now they're like below non-existent. Yeah, the ammunition stocks are minuscule at this point in time. Um, I don't even know. I think it's something like I've seen something like uh, Britain only has like 30,000 soldiers who actually are capable of fighting. Like, what is the UK army going to do if they decided to intervene in Ukraine? Like, they can't really do anything. Um, I guess the Air Force might be helpful, but they don't really have that much of a ground army at this point in time. The only one who really has the ground army would be the US. And is the US really going to go into direct warfare with Russia? I think one of the fears that Europe has at this point in time is that the US is just going to dump the whole thing on them, and they're going to be responsible for continuing the war against Russia basically by themselves. Russia and the US are going to kind of come to some agreement. America is going to go America's gonna go. Yep. Good job, guys. It's all up to you from here. We're gonna go save Israel. We're gonna go bail out Israel again. And it's gonna be left up to the EU to deal with this. And Europe's in a recession, and they don't have anything left. Europe has like no military industrial complex. I mean, they have one, but they don't have like anything near what the U.S. or once again, if anyone wants to say that I'm like exaggerating or that's wrong, that is just from the stuff that I have seen, particularly what comes out of Western sources. As I've said many times, I don't use Russian sources because I don't find them very reliable. Um, it's kind of like my issue with uh, right wing news. I find the fake news problem is much worse on the right than it is on the left. So how it generally works is left wing fake news is they will take something that actually happened or that will be technically factually incorrect, and they will lie by omission. They will lie by omission, or they will spin it, or they will have a misleading title or something like that. Like an example of this is the New York Times said something to the effect of uh, Ukraine made some gains in their offensive, but if you look at the actual article and you look at the total territorial gains for 2023, Russia actually made more, according to the article that says that Ukraine made gains. So that tends to be how Western media goes. When it comes to like dissident right or like a lot, some of the pro-Russian sources, some of them are good. They will just make stuff up. It'll just be like something complete fantasy. It'll just be like wishful thinking that they'll completely uh, kind of come up with. So I find the most effective thing is to mostly look at Western sources and try to look at the hard facts or the hard data within it. Cause like it'll get really weird. Like I know when in there's a recent one, I think it was called "It's Time to Stop Magical Thinking About Russia" in the Wall Street Journal. I think I forget if it was the Economist or Forbes or Wall Street Journal. One of the three. They're all kind of the same. And it said that the sanctions completely failed. And then later on in it, they say we have to keep doing the sanctions is the only way to beat Russia, and that'll be in the same article. And it'll just be like, yeah, but you just said they didn't work, and it's like it's so then people can go and quote that, and they can quote saying that Ukraine's winning. But if you read the actual article, that's not what it says. If you kind of try to look at the facts, but I know like when it comes to it really irritates me. A lot of like tradcasts do this is they will like lie about Pope Francis. And Pope Francis does so much crap. Like you don't have to lie about him. You don't have to make stuff up about him. Like he does all kinds of like cringy, awful stuff. You don't have to lie about Zelensky. You don't have to lie about Biden. Like lying when you don't need to is one of the absolute worst things you can do. Um, so where are we headed now? I do think it's quite likely that Avdiivka will fall by the end of the year. Um, I think Ukraine's going to give up on it, or the situation's just going to get so bad that Russia is going to um, go through it. Now the big question is the winter offensive. Now I built this up last year. I was wrong about it. I'm man enough to say that I was wrong. I thought Russia was going to do a winter offensive last year, and they didn't. There was no winter offensive. Bakhmut happened, but there was no general offensive. The question is, are they going to do that now? Now, what this kind of reminds us of very much so is a different spring offensive. So during World War One, Germany knocked Russia out of the war and forced them to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was an absolutely disastrous treaty. I don't know how Germany thought they were ever going to get away with it. Brest-Litovsk made Russia cede all of Ukraine, Belarusia, Eastern Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, all of that territory, and pay massive war indemnity and just kind of all these other mean conditions. So around that time, America entered the war, and America had been getting its army together, and they were going to come over with hundreds of thousands of fresh troops, who, well, maybe not experienced. They had a large number of soldiers who were fresh, who weren't wounded, who were enthusiastic, and more than that, America was bringing in its large fleet. They were bringing in the industrial, the agricultural stuff. The Allies were going. The Entente was going to get all this extra stuff. Um, so Germany decided, okay, we've knocked Russia out of the war. America's coming. This is our only chance left to win this thing. So we're going to do a YOLO offensive. We temporarily have an advantage in numbers because of the whole because Russia's out of the war. So we're just going to do a YOLO offensive. We're going to surge forward, and we're going to be wipe them out all at once. Um, and so they launched the spring offensive. The spring offensive, to my understanding, didn't have an overall goal. Uh, the stormtrooper tactics worked. Germany actually had a lot of initial success. There was no particular goal in question. They kept changing what the goal was on a daily basis in response to whatever the needs of the moment were. Uh, and the logistics system was not in place to keep up with how successful they were. So while they did an immense amount of damage to the Allies and they took some territory, all it really did was lengthen the front line. Germany burned through the last of its strategic reserves, and basically it left both sides devastated. Both the Entente and Germany were exhausted at that point in time. They didn't really have anything else to throw into the meat grinder, and America was showing up with its people. So that was basically why it was over. The Entente then launched the 100-day offensives, which basically led Germany to collapse and to seek peace treaty. So the point is that Ukraine's spring offensive actually does remind me a lot of this. They decided, you could argue that they decided that they were going to launch their offensive now before Russia could put all of its mobilized soldiers into action, and when they still enjoyed substantial support from Western powers. You could argue that the fear was that Western support is rapidly dwindling, and if they hadn't have uh, launched the offensive when they would have, the situation would have only gotten worse, and they would have fewer soldiers to do it. What's left of their strategic reserves and trained manpower would have been gone. So if they were going to win the war, this was their last chance, or at least to put themselves into a better position to negotiate. So obviously that didn't work out. So the question is now: is Russia going to launch their version of the 100-day offensive? Are they going to launch a winter offensive? Are they going to take their hundreds of thousands of fresh troops? They have a huge number of ballistic missiles in reserve, glide bombs. Are they just going to surge forward now and attempt to wipe out and make the Ukrainian army collapse? And that is the big question, because so far they have, whenever there's been an option between breaking Ukraine and taking large amounts of territory and having one of these big set piece battles and wearing Ukraine down, they've almost always picked the latter. So whether or not they're planning on this or not, I'm not sure. The winter is actually an interesting time to launch an offensive because even if it's cold, the ground is frozen. Um, it's not. I believe the worst times to launch an offensive in Ukraine is the spring and fall because I forget it's called Rasputnia, whatever the term is for the rains. There's a huge amount of rain. The ground turns to mud, and it's just not a situation you want to be in. So, so in the winter, it's cold, but the ground's frozen. So it's a lot easier for tanks to move over it. It's easier for trucks and infantry to move over it. It might be a bit slippery, but it's easier to deal with slippery ground than it is to deal with giant mud pits. So is Russia going to take this opportunity? You also have the advantage of Ukraine's heating system is a disaster. Ukraine's what's the other thing? There's the systems of disaster. The electrical systems of disaster. Russia has a whole bunch of missiles. They could just wipe out what's left of it at this point in time. I don't realistically know what Ukraine could do about it. But once again, I don't know. I think if Russia launches the winter offensive, Ukraine will start negotiating. by the summer. Um, is where I think we are at the moment. I think Avdiivka will probably fall by the end of the year, and if there's a Russian winter offensive, Ukraine will enter into negotiations. Now, what Putin has started to talk about, and he gave a big speech a couple days ago, is this idea that the Russian people are the three who are one. There's kind of the trinity of the Russian people: the Belarus, Kievan Rus, and Great Rus, and that the separation of the three is artificial. That they are one people brought together by a common culture, history, uh, related language, and above all, orthodoxy. That they are the Orthodox Eastern Slavic peoples, and they fundamentally are a family that belong together. And I don't know if we'd really seen this to the same extent previously. More and more as time goes on, it looks like Russia's war aims are expanding and towards the idea of some sort of forcing Ukraine into a union of sorts, or otherwise just directly taking it over. I don't think that Ukraine has any. I don't think Russia has any designs on Western Ukraine. I do think, though, you could argue that, like, up to the west, they might be trying to take. But we really have no idea. I personally don't think Putin even knows, really. I think it depends on how successful Russia is and how long the war goes on. The longer the war goes on and the more in Russia's favor it is, the worse the demands are going to get. As I've said many times, the initial demands, whether would have been held to or not, was autonomy for Donbass, for Lukansk and Donetsk, acceptance of Russian annexation of um, Crimea, and what was the third thing? And a promise to never join NATO, whereas Ukraine would be allowed to join the EU. Now, that was what was the initial one that was promised. That was what is claimed was the initial agreement. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's definitely grown from that. I don't think. Apparently, the original agreement wasn't even going to result in Lukansk and Donetsk being annexed by Russia. But who knows? Who really knows at this point in time? But my point is, it's obviously been growing pretty consistently as this war has been going on. We had the referendums to take Kherson and Zaporozhye, and they've been talking pretty extensively about Kharkov and Odessa also being war aims. I think one of the things people forget is, so someone once asked Putin, how would you describe yourself politically? And he said, I'm a pragmatist with a conservative bent, which is probably actually true. Like, something people don't get is a lot of the people in Russia are pretty far to the right of Putin when it comes to revanchism, when it comes to rebuilding the Russian Empire. Putin is pretty moderate on a lot of these issues. Um, like, and you can call me a Putin shill, but just from what I remember, he was very willing to be conciliatory with the West. He was willing to work with NATO, to work with the U.S. I think he just basically wanted the U.S. to respect Russia's sphere of influence, like to let them, like, that Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Chechnya, these places were part of Russia's sphere of influence. That the U.S. had no right to interfere in them, and to have a sort of like basically like neo detente. But I think Russia, like, honestly, if Russia had have gone and sorry, if I talked about this the other day when I was doing my suzerain stream, but I feel like if the greatest missed geopolitical opportunity for the U.S. perhaps ever was at the end of the Cold War, if America had have reached out the hand of friendship um, to Russia, if they had have said, "Look, communism's over. It's time to be the bigger man. We're going to send massive amounts of aid. We're going to help you modernize your economy. We're gonna help you guys out. We're going to lift. We're going to help. You're a defeated foe, but we're going to help you to your feet." I think if they had have done that, they would have earned basically Russia's eternal gratitude, and they could have been friends, or at least been like had a solid, stable working relationship, and it would have resulted in a much more secure world order. Um, I think that's possible. I think that Yeltsin and Putin initially wanted that, and I think, as I've said, them wanting to take a victory lap and shit on Russia and say we won, nana nana, you guys are screwed. You have no right to your sphere of influence. Fuck them over. Like in Game of Thrones, even Tywin Lannister said sometimes you have to help a defeated foe to their feet. Because like that's what you have to do. You either have to help your defeated foe to their feet, or crush them entirely so they're never going to be able to challenge you again. Because if you injure a man but let him get away, he can recover and he has every uh, intention of coming back and biting you. So you can say what you will. I just think, as a matter of pure practicality, um, that probably would have been a better idea. That wouldn't be possible because the objective American foreign policy, I can't read that out on YouTube, but I agree with you. Like, I find Putin's rhetoric over time has been getting less and less, I guess, what you could call like liberal conservative, and more like um, esoteric like Eurasianism, going back to like anti-Western Russian conservative thinkers from the 19th century. I will say this about Putin. Um, Putin is very well educated. It is kind of surprising to see like a world leader talking about like, I think one of his speeches he talked about Always with Honor, Peter Wrangel's memoir, and he will like make a lot of interesting historical references to letters or stuff that happened. I get the impression he's substantially smarter and better educated than a lot of Western leaders at the moment. I could be wrong though, but that's just the impression I get. Or his speech writers are just better. Um, well, let's just think about this for a second. Who's smarter, Putin or Biden? Like, is that even a question? That Putin is much smarter than Biden. Like, is this even a question? To be honest, like Biden's retarded. Like Biden isn't even there. Biden isn't even there. I don't think Trump's a genius. Trump, I think, is above average IQ. I think Trump probably has like a 115 IQ or something. Trump is good at reading people, and Trump is good at well, negotiation. He's a businessman. He wrote The Art of the Deal. He's good at making deals with people. He's good at looking at somebody, figuring out what it is they want, and coming to an agreement with them. I think, and I've talked about what Trump diplomacy is. I think Trump is very much in the vein of Teddy Roosevelt, walk softly but carry a big stick. Wherein Trump's like, okay, you're like, we're gonna blow the crap out of you if you fuck with us, but here's an agreement that allows you to save face, and we both win from it. And he's good. He was good with the carrot and the stick. And he was willing to sit down and talk to people. As I said, I don't like North Korea. I think North Korea is a very evil country in a lot of ways. But I much prefer him to like sit like the leader of the United States to sit down and try to talk to them and say, can we do business together? Can we de-escalate? That kind of thing. Um, so and people like shit on Trump so much for that, for going and talking to Kim Il Sung or whatever his name is. It's like I much prefer like Trump, like at least make an effort. Like you don't have to agree with the guy, you don't have to give him any concessions, but there's nothing really to be lost. It's like we're going to legitimize North Korea if we talk to them. Like, what kind of retarded logic is that? Like, yeah, if they like get rid of Putin, I mean, who's going to take over? Like, probably someone further to the right of him. Um, uh, Someone who isn't as reasonable. Um, yeah, the Koreans were in constant talks under Trump. He was willing to sit down with them. Now, Obama talked to Iran, and people were pissed off about that. I think the issue is more that Obama was just incompetent about talking to Iran, and he just gave them a bunch of money and like just fucked it up. But like, I do think that Trump talking to North Korea, um, yeah. So an interesting, yeah, that's a good point about so the details, I'm not sure, but it was kind of a nothing burger. But at the same time, I do think it de-escalated things, and it did. Trump, I'm just referring to someone in the chat. Trump meeting Kim in person. Um, I think it did de-escalate tensions, and I do think it at least gave the impression that they were willing to work together. I always want to keep in mind, just because I'm saying like we should sit down and talk to China, that doesn't mean I like China. I don't like China. I've been pretty adamant about it. I did a whole series making fun of China. China is probably the most pro-abortion country in human history. The kind of insane shit they did, particularly back in like the 80s, where they were like kidnapping women and like forcibly sterilizing them and stuff like that, is horrific. But like China is a great power, and there's no getting around it. And either you try to deal with them or you don't, and that's just kind of reality. Um, Unfortunately, no. But like China went insane with it during the one child era, and I could see them going back to that at some point. They're just China's just really screwed up. Christians aren't treated very well there. That I think is one of the worst things Francis did, was Um, he sold out the Chinese Catholic Church with some of the deals that he made. The other thing, and I maintain that the CCP is not based. Um, they know that the Chinese people are naturally very conservative, and they tilt their hat in that direction and throw them a bone every now and again. But I think the best description I've heard is that modern Chinese culture is a combination of the worst aspects of Han peasant culture with the worst aspects of Marxist culture, kind of just thrown together in this like materialist stuff. So no, he sold out the Chinese Catholics so bad. But it's why I hate it when people make stuff up about Francis. Is he did a lot of really shady shit. But people like have to make up stuff about him at the same time. That was, I think, yeah. Another thing I will say that I find interesting, and I've talked about this in the past, and this is slightly off topic, but the KMT and Chiang Kai shek are undergoing a soft rehabilitation on the mainland. Like Chiang Kai shek's become a fairly popular figure. I was looking at some articles on it. There's some restaurants that are named after him. They started selling some of his pictures. The Chinese government is basically saying that like the KMT, they've gone from the KMT being like these evil landlords to being a misguided patriotic movement that was trying to defend China from Japan and foreign aggressors. So they've kind of they're heading in that direction. I'm not sure if that's like to try to build better relations with Taiwan. The KMT, ironically, I think is partially funded by the CCP at this point in time. They definitely have much better relations than the left do on Taiwan. That's the weirdest thing about China. How the conservatives in Hong Kong are pro Beijing and the liberals in Hong Kong are anti Beijing. Uh, it's the same thing in no, Jiang Xiaoping. So at one point, and I never did this video, and I'm sorry. I read a biography of Deng Xiaoping. He Mao tried so hard to get him to endorse the Cultural Revolution. He maintained that it was a really bad idea, and they tried to like compromise with him. He's like, "Could you say it was 70% good and 30% bad?" And he's like, "No, I'm never going to support the Cultural Revolution. I'm never going to say that it was a good idea." Um, and that ultimately did help him, and they kind of memory hold the Cultural Revolution as much as they could because nobody liked it. No one wanted to go back to it. It's like people have to keep in mind when it comes to did the US influence Japan's post war constitution? Yeah, but you have to understand that a lot of Japanese people just didn't want to go back to the 1930s and 1940s. They didn't want to go back to the national mobilization state. They didn't want to go back to total war with everybody, go back to like a corrupt military oligarchy. A lot of the Japanese people wanted a pacifist liberal constitution because they didn't want to be ruled by like LARPy quasi fascists again. So, as I've said in the past, I have a lot of sympathy for Taiwan, a lot more than I do for Ukraine, and especially for Israel. I actually don't mind if the U.S. gives money to Taiwan, um, but it's kind of where we're at the moment. Uh, I also I don't know. This is okay. So you know what? We'll conclude this. There's another thing I want to talk about, and that is the third worldist support for Russia, which is like some of the most schizo things. So a lot of the pro Russia people are not like me, who are conservatives who don't like global homo. They're people who like global homo, who like the UN, but hate America, and it leads to this really bizarre worldview. So something I'll see a lot is they'll be like, well, we just have to like for the Israel thing, we just have to do what the UN Security Council says. And like, but the UN Security Council has America, France, and Britain as permanent members, and they don't. At least America and Britain don't want to implement the two state solution, or whatever. They don't want to pass anti-Israel. They will veto the Israel stuff. So it's like we need to do what the Security Council says, except not do what the Security Council says, because what the Security Council says um, is is bad. Um, just like, huh? And then they'll also like the narrative will be that Western countries like are using NGOs and stuff to subvert and control third world countries. But the agenda that the Western countries are promoting are things that they support. So like America is going in and they're forcing these countries to legalize gay marriage and abortion and bring in feminism stuff and stuff like that. And then they'll complain that America is like interfering with these countries, even though America is interfering in a way that accomplishes their political agenda. So it's like they'll complain about the neocons, but what the neocons want is basically the same as them. Their issue is just that the neocons are insignificantly anti-white, which I think says something. Is they will be against America bringing these in because they hate white people and they perceive it as being some form of white supremacy. It is as far as I can determine. But they'll complain like they'll say stuff basically like homophobia is like an American import. Um, that like all these countries would have legal gay marriage or would be pro gay if the U.S. didn't force them to have it not, and just the degree to which like the mental gymnastics are just really weird because they support basically the entirety of the neocon agenda. They just don't like white people, and that's really the only distinction. I don't know. Could anyone in the chat want to say something about like about left wing pro Russia people or left wing third worldists or whatever? Like, I find that's also kind of part of the whole Hamas narrative. So I doing some research. Israel did prop up Hamas, but like the narrative will be that the Palestinians were like these secular liberal, like classical liberal dudes, um, and they only became Islamists because Israel forced them to. There was no like that is not a reflection of their culture. That's not a reflection of indigenous political thinking. It's something that was like forced on them by Israel and America. Um, it's also kind of like this whole like Ukraine Nazi thing, which is very exaggerated. This so it's funny how many decolonized countries were more conservative by the time decolonization happened than the metropolitan. They're either do-goodist Nazbols or simply pro-brown people. I mean no, I mean the Palestinian movement was more Ba'athist until like that's definitely true. I'm just saying you get what I'm saying. You all get what I'm saying. Um, it's just really weird. It's like the people who and Brian Berletic is like the ultimate example of a schizo poster on this because he lives in Thailand and he complains about American intervention, but like the American NGOs basically support like all the shit that he supports. So it's this bizarre scenario where he's like trying to defend the Thai military government, even though the Thai military government is like anti anti democratic. It's is against liberal democracy and something like that. It's like, but like, so like the argument is that America is undermining liberal democracy by forcing countries to adopt liberal democracy. Like it just none of it really makes any kind of sense to me. Um, it's just very incoherent. Because to me, neoconservatism it did develop out of literally the same perspective. It was the perspective that we need like global democratic revolution, and we need it now. Like neoconservatism came out of didn't come out of neoconservatives has nothing in common with realism in terms of IR theories. If anything, neocons hate realists. Like if you ever watch John Mearsheimer being interviewed, he's always just complaining about how like neocons have no idea what the fuck they're doing. Neoconservatism is extremely idealistic, sort of liberal thing. The only real area where neoconservatism differs from traditional liberal IR is they don't think America should be subject to the international system. I think in their own way they are pro UN, they are pro international organizations, they are pro like global integration. They just think that these things don't apply to the US. And the US has the unlimited right to act unilaterally whenever they choose to. So I would say that is it's kind of just the neocon perspective, and it's just weird. But yeah, no, it's a lot of the people we have now are just very fanatical in terms of how they view the world. But just the right wing, like the left wing third worldists, who are like Russia, because like how do you make the argument that Russia is like the liberal like country, whereas the West is like this imperialist, conservative, like white supremacist thing that like it's just bizarre. Um, it's just really weird. It's a perspective I don't really get, to be honest. I guess once again, like the thing you have to understand about modern leftism is until you understand that the point of modern leftism is to hate white people, Christians, and males, none of it will make sense. All of it will seem completely incoherent. Why all these people who hate each other are in a coalition? Until you understand that they're united by their hatred of those three things, then um, it will not make any sense to you. Um, and if you look at it through that lens, then that's kind of how it goes. But I think that's everything. People in the chat, is there anything else you'd like me to cover? I think I covered the current global situation, how the war is progressing in Ukraine, what the internal conflicts are in Ukraine, and stuff like that. So I'll just give people another minute if they want to talk about some stuff. I don't know how to feel about Colonel McGregor, to be honest. I never really can tell if his predictions are accurate or not. He's definitely an interesting commentator, but I never know really how much of what he puts forward is a meme and how much of it isn't. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. How do you think Chechnya will develop? Lots of Russians hate Putin because of how much leeway he's given them. So I find the Chechens have more or less become Russia's Varangian Guard. So it's often useful for ruling regimes to bring in minorities to serve as their like elite forces or their palace guard. The emperors would often do this in Rome, where they'd bring in imperial German bodyguards or Iberian bodyguards or Gaulish or some minority because they had no separate support bases. So if you brought in Germans to serve as your bodyguard as an emperor, they were completely 100% um, dependent upon you. And if anything happened to you, if you got removed from office, if you got removed from power, the local population would probably immediately kill them. And so it was in their interest to do everything possible to keep you alive and to keep you in power. And they were kind of, to a certain extent, immune from palace intrigues and stuff like that. And I feel like the Chechens kind of have that position within Putin's government, that they are a politically reliable group that he can bring in whenever he needs somebody to kind of do the dirty business that's outside of the normal Russian political structure. And I think we saw that during the March for Justice, where they were brought in as the forces to put down Wagner, because I think they were considered to be much more politically reliable than the rest of the Russian army, and there was not really any concern about them defecting. Now the Chechens have their own agenda and stuff like that. Um, so I think that's uh, yes, but the Chechen leadership is all Islamist, which is usually a gateway for Saudi or Langley influence. I suppose so. I'm just saying, I that's I think kind of what the thinking is at the moment. Whether that or not that's exactly the truth, I'm not sure. But I think that's what Putin is using the Chechens for at the moment. We'll see where that goes. Next question. About that idea of NATO expanding to that part of Ukraine. So is this confirmation that Poland will occupy the western half of its ass? This is something that Medvedev and a lot of the Russian people bring up. Is they're really big on this idea that uh, there's a plan to for Poland to take eastern Ukraine. Uh, for Poland to take eastern Ukraine in the event that Ukraine collapses and that there will be some sort of partition with Russia. Now, I don't think that this is going to happen. Um, it kind of sounds like something that Russia is using to try to get to kind of spread disinformation or to try to get the various anti-Russian powers to fight each other. So I'm not really sure, to be honest. I think it's definitely possible, but I don't really see it at the moment. Um, Something Germany tried to do when they partitioned Czechoslovakia is they let Poland take a little portion of it, with the idea being that they could say, well, I mean, Poland took part in the partition of Czechoslovakia, so you can't blame us for it. Your friends, Poland, your friends are in charge of that. I think the Polish people are very tired of the supporting Ukraine. I think the whole grain deal soured a lot of people and how they were undercutting Polish grain prices. So I do think that is something that caused a lot of negative feelings within Poland, and I think there's some strikes at the moment going on among people who are just not happy with the current state of affairs. Okay, so let's see here. Okay. Um, has Coffin of Andy and Lele praise? It's your turn to play it. What the fuck is the Coffin of Andy and Lele? Let me look at this. What is this shit? What nonsense are you people bringing up? By the way, the suzerain, it'll take me a couple days probably to edit that, but that will be up at some point. Brother and sister practice cannibalism after witnessing a botched satanic ritual. Okay. Honestly, as far as like weird schizo games go, the one that I was more interested in is the where is it? Let me find it. Slay the Princess. Slay the Princess looked like a better schizo game to me, but
But she's a princess.
maybe. Okay, well, I think that covers it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope that was informative. I hope that was interesting. God bless everyone on this Sunday.